Hello, my friend. How are you doing today? An update. We're going to do an update on Spinoza today. We are trying to get through a selection of his works that was published a long time ago. And last time we were into his essay, God, Man, and His Well-Being. We went up to page 58. And we'll continue on in this essay where Spinoza gives his attributes of God as having thought and extension. And what we end up noticing is that there's a lot lost in the translation. This was originally published in Latin, and so there is something that is missing from what happens when you switch from Latin into English. And the terms that he uses are difficult to understand, and even the editor makes notes that sometimes the translation is difficult. But the fact that he was a theist is no doubt. And he calls modes things. He uses different terms that are important to remember as you're reading through it. He says, the one eternal infinite being who exists through himself. He mentions the two arch enemies of the human race, namely hatred and remorse, and sometimes also oblivion. So you could say three enemies of the human race: hatred, remorse, and oblivion. So every once in a while he throws out these insights which are interesting to contemplate on. But beyond that, he goes on in this essay and he presents an argument as a dialogue between these two characters, Erasmus and Theophilus. And they argue whether God is an immanent cause or a remote cause. And I think this is completely inconsequential, so I'm going to skip that section. It's an argument just that has no application to modern discourse at all. You know, if I were to ask you, what do you think? Is God more an immanent cause or a remote cause? That would mean nothing to anybody today. And yet, Spinoza spent many words going through just such an argument, which, as I mentioned, maybe means more in Latin, but it's gone. It's been lost to the pages of history, and its relevance is no longer of any concern to us, except for the most obscure philosophical researcher. He comes to the conclusion in his chapter 3 of this essay, which he entitles that God is a cause of all things. I don't know why he says a cause of all things and not the cause of all things. He says, wherefore we may say with all reason that God is a cause of all things. I don't know if that's a translational error or just the way the author wrote it. And oftentimes he uses this statement. He says, this is self-evident. Oftentimes when he's discussing something and he says, well, if God were to exist, he would have to have these qualities or those qualities. And then he'll say, this is self-evident. And so you realize that a lot of his arguments are leaning towards the ontological argument or ontological-based arguments. Now, what is ontological? Ontological is a word that's used to describe something to do with existence, something to do with our reality is considered ontological. And ontological arguments are arguments in philosophy usually are used to reference the existence of God, arguments that are not dependent on outside evidence. They are arguments strictly based on internal reasoning, the internal thought. And simply by using one's internal logic, reasoning, thoughts, one analyzes reality, and based on one's perception of reality, one makes premises and uses these premises to support the existence of God or to support whatever argument they want to argue for. But typically, the ontological argument is in reference to the existence of God without depending on some type of outside evidence. We just say, well, if there's a being that's perfect, and we can imagine such a being as being perfect, then such a being must exist. It's almost that simplified. It's almost that elementary. You know what I mean? And Spinoza depends on that throughout the next. I've reached up to page 106, and so for the next 40 pages, this is the type of reasoning that he's using: ontological arguments. Non-existence is the greatest imperfection, he says, and for something to be imperfect, it must not be God, and something therefore must be on the other side of imperfection, and it must be perfect, and if it's perfect, then it must be the highest perfection, and if there is a higher perfection, then that perfection must be God, therefore God must exist. It kind of ends up sounding like that because it gets very repetitive and over and over and over again. And personally, I don't find these ontological arguments started with Saint Anselm of Canterbury, and then they were adopted by René Descartes. I believe René Descartes is maybe Saint Anselm is from hundreds of years earlier, 1100s, or René Descartes is prior to Spinoza, and then Spinoza dependent upon René Descartes. René Descartes also uses ontological argument. And then we had Immanuel Kant come along, and Kant argued against such arguments. But we've never had a strong philosophical argument against ontological arguments. However, I'm surprised that there hasn't been, because such type of self-dependent, bootstrap type of thinking, I have a very difficult time giving any credence to, because, well, I'm not going to go there because it's just depressing to go there, right? It's just self-generated reasoning to support a preconceived conclusion. Let's continue on this essay. I'll try and point out anything that jumps out at me. And I'm just going to briefly go through my notes. It is because God wills to be God that he is God. Therefore, it is in his power not to be God, which is absurdity itself. So oftentimes he'll say the opposite of his argument is absurd. Therefore, his argument must be true. Excuse me. And oftentimes he uses Latin at the end of his arguments, where he'll put at the end of a paragraph QED. Whenever you see QED, that is Latin for quod est decidorum. I'm sorry, I forget what it is, but it basically means quod est demonstratum. It's something like and thus it has been demonstrated. And when you see QED, it means the previous paragraph has just demonstrated his point to be true. In other words, so it's kind of like, so there, right? At the end, he'll say such and such, therefore God exists, QED, thus has been demonstrated. It's essentially saying the previous writing has confirmed the point he was trying to make. You see that in his writing fairly often. God, who now in the past and unto all eternity is, has been, and will remain immutable. He makes statements like that, and he throws them out. But the only worthwhile takeaway from all this is that Spinoza is 100% theist. He is constantly arguing for the existence of God. I don't know why anyone would consider anything but a theist, but it's good to get it straight from the horse's mouth. So he does get into the problem of evil. he says that some people would object, how is it possible that God, who is said to be supremely perfect and the sole cause, disposer, and provider of all, nevertheless permits such confusion to be seen everywhere in nature? And this is kind of hinting at the problem of evil. But then he goes on to say that all things and works which are in nature are perfect. So he eventually dismisses the argument as not valid. God as a being existing through or of himself, cause of all things, omniscient, almighty, eternal, simple, infinite, the highest good, of infinite compassion. He lists all the attributes of God. And he says that God has the essence, and his essence is through thought and extension. And then he goes on to spend so much time what he means by thought and extension, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is not really relevant for discussions of today. He mentions that, he said, therefore good and evil do not exist in nature. All things which are in nature are either things or actions. Now good and evil are neither things nor actions. Therefore good and evil do not exist in nature. So he kind of skirts around the problem of evil and never really addresses it. He addresses it in a way that dismisses it, basically. He talks a lot about substances. He says that without God, no thing can be or be understood. Okay. Without God, we can neither be nor be known. And he mentions that when we have union with God, we are able to experience union with him through nature and love. So a lot of little of these little tidbits I will pull out and I'll put them in the notes. And if they're worth remembering, then I will make a note of them, and I'll put them in the comments in the notes underneath the video so that you can see what Spinoza has to say. And I'm just going through my notes here to see if there's anything. And then finally, up until that essay takes us up until page 94. And then we start this long essay called Ethic, E-T-H-I-C, Ethic. And Ethic extends for the next 300 pages. And that is the main selection that is included in this book. We had a couple of essays at the beginning, but the main essay that's included is called Ethic. And I guess this is the most famous of Spinoza's publications. And I believe it was published in the year that he passed away and became very popular and well read at the time. And then the book finishes with a selection of personal letters, correspondence that he did with other people. And so I started to get into this essay called Ethic. I read the first 10 pages of it or so, and what he does is he creates a bunch of propositions, and the first part is called of God. And so he creates all these propositions, which he calls definitions and axioms, and he outlines all these things which are very obscure, like, it pertains to the nature of substance to exist. It pertains to the nature of substance to exist. Every substance is necessarily infinite. Of substance cannot be produced by another substance. And each time he makes one of these statements, he goes in and describes them a little bit. And so they're very obscure. They're very difficult to apply. As I said, they may be of interest to somebody that is, trying to see where he was at. But Proposition 11, he says, God or substance consisting of infinite attributes, each one of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. And so he uses this definitional proof of God, which is an ontological argument for the existence of God. He just says God exists by definition, right? Because God or substance, he essentially says God, which is substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of one which expresses eternal and infinite essence necessarily exists. And Spinoza would go on to say that this must be self-evident. And so he just, from 0 to 100 right out of the gate. Infinite essence describes God. That is God's character. Therefore, God must exist. Full stop. That's Spinoza's argument for God. Now, he goes into a lot of more subtleties, and maybe I'm giving him short thrift. And if I am, I'm sorry. But that's how it ends up coming across throughout the many repetitive propositions and premises that he puts forward in the first 100 or so pages. So as I said, I'm in the middle of this essay called Ethic, and I am going to try and get through it. The applicability for today is I haven't found it yet, and I don't expect to find it. It's similar to René Descartes. René Descartes went on and on and on for ages, and what do we remember from him? His single statement, I think, therefore I am. So Spinoza probably has a couple of individual statements by which he'll be remembered, but as far as his ontological arguments for the existence of God, they do not carry the weight that I believe he originally hoped they would, especially in today's scientific environment of, looking at the cosmos or trying to explain the Big Bang or any of that stuff, or especially since the time of Darwin, where Darwin gave fuel to people like Dawkins who just said, oh, stuff just came from nothing, and they just eventually became more and more complicated. And so that argument for the non-existence of God is just as lame, if not worse, than the ontological argument based on premises pulled out of the ether, So that's that. That's as far as I got so far, and I'm going to cut this video short because, if I can finish this book and put together maybe 1 or 2 videos to finish it off, I don't expect anything else from it, from what I've seen so far, but I could end up being surprised, and if I am surprised, I will share that with you. But if not, we've done our duty. We've done our duty. We've gone through Spinoza, and if somebody asks us, hey, what do you think about Spinoza? I know what to say. I said, oh, okay, Spinoza, he, believed in God. He felt that he was able to prove the existence of God through an ontological argument based on his own premises of the characteristics of God, because God has all these perfect characteristics that gives him his proof in his own mind that God exists. But for me today, it's not very encouraging. That's not to say I'm not happy the guy's an atheist. I mean, I'm glad that he's on the same team, so to speak. But and of course, so far, no mention of the great teacher, no mention of his name anywhere. And perhaps at the time, that was something that he was trying to somehow avoid, or perhaps in his specific situation that he lived in, he was not able to mention Christ for whatever reason. I don't know. But that's certainly a possibility. Anyway, I hope that you're doing well. Do you have anything more exciting than this? You know what? Pretty much anything that you could be working on is more exciting than studying Spinoza. Anything. Well, maybe not anything. Maybe not inconsequential video game. I don't know. But even that's more exciting. But as far as having weight, having valid consequences for life that could be helpful or productive, whatever it is you're working on, I hope that it helps you to be a better person, to live a more successful life. I don't know why I'm studying this book, but I'm glad that you don't have to, because it would be a gross waste of time. But thank you so much for watching. God bless you. I love you very much. I really hope you're doing well, whatever you're working on. I appreciate you watching, and if you have anything you'd like me to check out, please leave it in the comments, and I will definitely address it as soon as I can. Take care of yourself. We'll talk to you again real soon, okay? Bye-bye now. Bye.